First-run movies in theaters, men and women sitting together watching them, women driving cars. These are just a few of the things that have become possible in Saudi Arabia under the man they call MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who took the helm in 2017. The 32-year-old Crown Prince has embarked on an ambitious plan of economic and social reform in the kingdom. Does it represent a real transformation or just window dressing? And how might it contribute to the overall state of the Middle East? Let's find out. In Washington, D.C. via Skype, we welcome Hussein Ibish, Senior Resident Scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute. And in our studio, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. Delight to welcome both of you back to TVO. Hussein, nice to have you on the air again with us here.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Let's put you to work right away. It's been 6 months since MBS began to revamp Saudi Arabia from the top down. Tell us, in your view, why he's doing what he's doing.
Well, I think there are really two reasons. The first is a financial reason. Even though oil prices have rebounded a little bit recently, Saudi Arabia's economy of the past and its social economic system over the past few decades was based on a set of oil prices and a kind of level of foreign exchange coming into Saudi Arabia that won't be there anymore. And within a few years, they're going to face either the situation of either going broke or changing the basic economic structure of the country. In other words, having people go to work, having them do stuff for themselves, not being dependent on public handouts, and becoming really productive, engaged, empowered citizens rather than dependent subjects is essential for the country to move forward. And in addition to that, there is this lingering sense that the Arab world is stuck in a kind of stasis, and that if you don't have change led from the top down, it can erupt as it did in the Arab Spring in 2011, and that uncontrolled change is the alternative to controlled change. The status quo is just not going to continue. So here you've got a very specifically Saudi problem, which is they're running out of money, and a general sense that in the Arab world, change is real, radical change is inevitable. So here's a guy who wants to control it.
Besma, before I get you to comment, I guess I should remind everybody one of the reasons we're having this conversation tonight on the agenda is that immediately after this program, we're going to have the first of a three-part BBC documentary series called The House of Saud. And I guess just to set up the rest of our conversation, let's look at a clip from that documentary and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, go.
That night in November, the Crown Prince also took control of all three armed forces in the country. Among those detained was the son of the previous king and the head of the National Guard. Some say the arrests were less about corruption and more about seizing power.
In effect, the Crown Prince has rolled up his critics, his potential opponents within the royal family. It was a raw demonstration of a level of power that none of his predecessors had.
We've seen a purge of the Saudi royal family and the Saudi elite that we've never seen anything like before in Saudi society. We've seen two crown princes removed from the line of succession with no explanation provided. These are unprecedented developments, and it raises real possibilities of further fractures within the royal family.
Besma, what's your view on whether anti-corruption is really what some of this is about as well?
Definitely not. The people that were arrested were neither the most corrupt, nor were they ones that were, frankly, a challenge to MBS in terms of reforms. They were truly the ones who potentially could stand in his way politically. And so this was a politically motivated consolidation of powers, quite simply. We saw two strands of people, those like, as mentioned, previously the person who ran the National Guard system. We had people who were in charge of the media that were rounded up. Again, they were not the most corrupt. This is a country that's very corrupt, so there's plenty of people to round up. But certainly the people that were arrested were the ones that would challenge him politically and had potentially the legitimacy to challenge him politically. Those are the ones that were arrested.
Has he now consolidated, in your view, has he consolidated his power base enough to give himself some security?
Absolutely. And the most important part is he has the support of millions of young people behind him. So this is a very popular leader. For all his flaws, he's a very popular leader.
Hussein, you wrote that MBS is behaving like any of his predecessors. If he is, it is King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, who founded the modern Saudi state back in 1932. Why do you make that comparison?
Yeah, because I think what we've seen here in the seizure of power, which actually took place before the anti-corruption crackdown, which you were just talking about, I do agree largely with Basma that it was political more than legal or economic, but he had consolidated a lot of power. I mean, in effect, he had power before that. But what he's doing with this power is recreating Saudi society. This was an autogolpe, a self-coup. We don't have a good word for it in English. But in Spanish, they call it a self-coup, where the people at the very top remain, but the entire socio-political structure underneath it gets changed by decree. And that's what you're seeing. And so what I meant by that comment is that whereas the founder of the Saudi state created the system that existed until now we have a new Saudi state, and really it's the fourth monarchy, because the state that was created in 1920s was the third Saudi state, and now I think we have the fourth Saudi state.
Let us see if we can whet the appetite of our viewers just a little bit more in hopes that they'll stick around and watch the BBC documentary that will air immediately after this program. So, Sheldon, one more clip, shall we? Go.
People in the West accuse Arab royal families of being corrupt because Arab royal families are very wealthy, as Western royal families are, and they generated their wealth in the same form and manner. The Queen of Holland is wealthy, the Queen of Sweden is wealthy, and British nobility is extremely wealthy. So elites have enriched themselves, and there's no reason why the House of Saud should be held to a different standard than the House of Windsor, for example, has. I think what has happened in the West is that elites have found sort of much more sophisticated ways of enriching themselves from power. Maybe the elites in Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, are still on the more basic level.
How do you like his comparison of the corruption that happens in the House of Saud compared to the House of Windsor?
It's not a very appropriate one, but nevertheless, the reality is that there is an enormous hunger among young people to see this very, I call it a kleptocracy, more so than a monarchy, come to some change. And they are looking at MBS as some form of savior, that he is going to clean house. And at minimum, the fact that you've had rounding up of about 100 and so individuals is just 100 and so less people to be on the national payroll. I mean, this is the reality. Look, MBS is able to, I think, shrink the monarchy in terms of those who are going to be now those receiving benefits from the state, because he's effectively skipped a couple of generations in terms of who are the royal family that will be the preferred ones. Remember, we had at some point 6,000 members of the monarchy, and they were all on very generous payroll systems, all of them connected to business interest and taking a cut off the top of all business coming into the country and all production out of the country. So this is a cleaning of house. It's streamlining the monarchy to a smaller core of individuals. And I think for most Saudis, that's a welcome change, very much so.
If, however, Hussein, you compare the Saudis to their neighbors, do you think their corruption is any more endemic than anybody else's in the region?
Maybe not compared to some of the smaller Gulf Arab states. It may all be very similar, but let's put it this way. Saudi Arabia is a very large country, geographically and demographically, and it has something like 30 million people almost in it. And in other words, it's not possible for everyone to be middle class or upper middle class or something like that. Even if you restricted it just to all citizens, there's a lot of poor people in Saudi Arabia. There's a very big middle class in Saudi Arabia. So if you have, in other words, a level of corruption, endemic corruption, at an elite level in a country like that, and then you start to have austerity, and you start to have a really difficult, sort of social shift where a lot of the relationship, the dependent relationship of a lot of the public to the government gets changed, and people are basically told, look, you have to work, you have to look out for yourself, you have to become productive. That's not necessarily a welcome thing for people to hear. So when a lot of that is packaged as anti-corruption, and when a kind of a mixture of social transformation, political centralization, and economic resurrection is all packaged as anti-corruption, it's very, very popular. And we saw that in China, by the way. We've seen it in many parts of the world. Anti-corruption is one of the most popular things you can do.
Having said that, Besma, is it possible that MBS has suddenly decided that trying to figure out the differing political agendas of 2,000 different princes, all of whom seem to be free agents from time to time, pursuing their own idea of foreign policy, kind of is no way to run a railroad?
I think it's, look, he's done a good job in terms of putting in some real substantive changes on the ground that are cultural, social, extremely welcomed. I have absolute high regard for the changes that have been made because the Saudi people deserve it. The young people, which I wrote a book about, you remember, Arab Dawn, very much want this. So they've been calling for it. And the one country that I always said was going to see the most rapid change, it was going to be Saudi Arabia, because you had in there a young society that was very educated. Remember here, 90,000 students were sent to the United States alone, half of which were women, under the King Abdullah Scholarship Program. And we had that for more than a decade. Remember, all of those millions of people were returning to Saudi Arabia now with Western values. I'm always astonished at how many Saudis I meet that have perfect English. I mean, this is a society that's highly educated, wants meritocracy, wants to work, wants a lifestyle, let's be honest, very similar to our Western liberal one. And they're fed up with the cronyism, with the kleptocracy, and the old ways of being. That said, and he's done some great things on the social and cultural front, he's got plenty of critics and plenty of problems with his foreign policy.
Well, in terms of foreign policy, Hussein, let me follow up with you on this. We know 9/11, 2001, has its genesis in Saudi Arabia. And I wonder whether you think MBS's efforts at reform will go deeply enough to try to get to the bottom of that and root out the evil there.
Well, I mean, definitely he has staked out a position being very critical of the kind of ultra-conservative version of Wahhabism that predominated in the decades leading up to 9/11 and since then. And he says he wants to go back to, he dates it from 1979. In other words, he's pegging it to the Iranian Revolution. Actually goes back a bit further than that, to say the least. But he is, I mean, that's actually quite a good way of selling it to the public. It's a smart thing to say, even if it's not historically that accurate. So he's committed to trying to change the kind of the way the government and public largesse pushes people towards more tolerant and less extreme versions of Islam, or the other way around. And so you're already seeing a pattern of defunding extreme mosques and other institutions overseas. And I think over time, it will definitely have an impact. I think over time, it had a very negative impact. That is, say, the Saudi government's support of intolerant and extreme fundamentalist views. And I think if they change that, it will have a big effect, but it's going to take a while.
Esma, your view on the 9/11 angle?
Well, more on this idea of the Wahhabi angle, and as I'm sure Hussein knows, in his interview, in MBS's interview with The Atlantic's editor Jeffrey Goldberg, he actually said there's no such thing as Wahhabism, which I thought was such a unbelievable statement, because indeed, I think for many who watch the region, the most intolerant, the most, frankly, obscure interpretation of Islam often came from Saudi Arabia. It was like no other. And the fact that they were putting millions of dollars behind it and propagating it across everywhere from Europe to very liberal societies like Bosnia, all the way to Indonesia and Malaysia, was very problematic. We were getting a Wahhabi version of Islam being propagated across the world with a lot of money backing it. And that is enormous. I think what's important here is not only is there a lack of recognition that, frankly, this is an intolerant view of Islam that is frankly, not applicable to 99% of Muslims. It's a very, very, strict interpretation. I call it sort of the Amish version of Christianity.
But it has
very
been
specific,
the
right?
foundation of Saudi Arabia,
But
though.
it's the foundation of Saudi Arabia, and they've put millions and billions of dollars behind it by building mosques, schools across the world to the detriment of, frankly, most Muslims out there. So there's something very problematic about that. And I'm afraid, from everything that I've seen from MBS, he does not acknowledge or recognize how damaging that is and how alien that particular interpretation of Islam, that Wahhabi interpretation, which is frankly a shade of gray away from ISIS philosophy, in my opinion, in terms of the basic principles of it, how detrimental that was to the entire philosophy of Islam. So I think this is really the challenge. And I just recently saw that they've just poured millions of more dollars into Bangladesh. No, thank you. I think what the Saudis need to do is acknowledge that they have been a source of not helping the Muslim world, but actually not helping them at all, and they need to really pull back and fund schools, fund community centers, fund parks, for God's sakes. Enough with your particular interpretation, because it's not welcomed and it's alien in the vast majority of the Muslim world.
Let me just push back on that a little bit, because I don't actually disagree with any of that. But let's say you accept that, right, and agree with it, and I think it's largely true. And you are MBS, and you say, right, we don't like this extreme version, we don't like this intolerance, we see it's a threat. What politically would be the smart thing to do? Would it be to get into a protracted argument with your public about what is Wahhabism or not Wahhabism and what is Islam or not, or just to say this is what we want and start pushing for that and funding that? So intellectually and historically, it's dishonest to say there's no Wahhabism, but politically, it's actually very smart. And especially if you are sincere in trying to push a new, more moderate, more tolerant version, you get a lot further, a lot faster by avoiding the debate over terminology and just saying, oh, no, that's not the issue. The issue is tolerance and meeting the rest of the world with open arms. So I actually think it was kind of a smart thing. But it's a dumb thing to say to the rest of the world, but it's very smart internally in Saudi Arabia.
But I presume, Besma, that the Wahhabi clerics cannot be thrilled with the idea of men and women sitting together in movie theaters and women driving and all of the other modernization efforts that MBS has taken on, right?
Oh, absolutely right. I mean, this is now one of his staunchest critics. They have the most to lose out of the reforms that he's doing. And in fact, going back to the idea of 1979, it was a deal made with the Wahhabi clerics themselves, basically saying, well, we're going to find a distinguishing, a distinguishing factor for us that identifies us, and it's going to be this very strict, again, very obscure interpretation of Islam. My key thing here is that they should not be in the business of propagating anything to do with Islam. And I think until they really fundamentally understand how much harm they've done to the overall faith, I think we're not going to see a real change on that. But again, this is not to say I agree completely with Hussein's view that this is something that had to be done with his own domestic constituents, which frankly are very much opposed to his reforms and changes. They very much are eyeing for him.
The clerics have been told, and there's no doubt about this, that he's not interested in what they have to say, that they just have to accept it and sit down and be quiet and take the money or get in trouble. And really, that's the story here. Clerics are not successfully pushing back yet, and there's no sign of that. One of the reasons for the crackdown, there was the crackdown, we talked about corruption. There was an earlier crackdown on clerics, some of them reformists, many of them ultra-conservatives. There was a whole range of people. And before that on journalists. So there's been a series of power moves designed, I think, to concentrate power practically and to send the message to everyone, clerics included, this is where we're going, get out of the way.
As we look for more reasons or more explanations as to why what's happening is happening, Besma, how much is Saudi Arabia's increasing antipathy to Iran and what looks like a looming conflict there, how much of that is part of this story?
It's an enormous part of the story. There were some commentators who were as blunt as suggesting that this whole reform package, which I don't think is true, but this whole reform package of social cultural change was really about shining light that they were the reformers and that the Iranians weren't, that they were allowing women into their stadiums while the Iranians weren't. I mean, all of these kinds of things, which I think is a bit ridiculous because there's plenty to criticize about Iran, but in terms of female advancement, they've done a far better job on a whole number of markers than the Saudis have or frankly will ever be in the next next at least 20 to 30 years. So that said, I think there is a great deal of PR in this. Let's not forget that this is a large PR campaign of the Saudi government. Part of removing things like the prohibition on women driving is because MBS quite rightly knows, and his advisors who come from McKinsey and our management consultants, astutely told him, this does not play well. You are not going to get foreign investment until you get rid of this thorn in your side. So some of these reforms, I dare say, are not all genuine reforms because of some altruism coming out of the kingdom. It's really about being strategic to both bring in foreign investment and take the eye away from the focus on the Saudis and their domestic policy.
One of the things, Hussein, that also emerged from that interview that was done by MBS with the Atlantic magazine was probably the most peaceful thing anybody in Saudi Arabia has ever said about Israel. There was an acknowledgement of Israel's right to exist, and even more beyond that. What do you make of this apparent thaw between Saudi Arabia and Israel?
Well, and first of all, there's a real imperative on the part of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab countries because of Iran to look for opportunities to get closer to the Israelis, to have a strategic dialogue, to see what can be accomplished with the Israelis. But they've got to see some progress on the Palestinian front first, for reasons I'll explain in a second. But let me just say what he said was that the Israelis, like any other people, have the right to a country, and so do the Palestinians, and that's why they support a two-state solution. This was important because he talked about Jewish nationalism, Zionism in Israel, as normative, as natural, not as something artificial or a colonial imposition or anything like that. That's kind of new, not for any Arab leader, but for an Arab leader with regional aspirations. It's new. On the other hand, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the other Gulf countries will need progress on the Palestinian front for three reasons. First, political. There'll be major political blowback if they get closer to the Israelis without any progress on the Palestinians. Secondly, there's principles. They are not value-free people. They're Arabs. They do care about Palestine. Yeah, they have national interests, but they do care. And the last and the most important is the strategic need for a resolution, because for them, they see that Iran, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, ISIS all benefit tremendously from this occupation and from the conflict, and that they will never have a good night's sleep or the kind of security they crave until the Israeli-Palestinian issue is successfully dealt with. So for those three reasons, right, I mean, political, principled, and strategic, they need progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front. And there's another report today about MBS saying very forthcoming things to Jewish leaders, and yet he said that again.
Let me, Besma, take you back to Iran for a second. Do you see in Saudi Arabia an overarching strategic goal as it relates to Iran? And if so, what is it?
It's regime change, which is a bit absurd because they don't have the capacity to do it. But, this is MBS's foreign policy par excellence strategy, which is to basically, go for the juggernaut and then worry about everything else later, which is not the way to do things. It's the way he took the invasion in Yemen. It's the way he kidnapped the Lebanese prime minister. It's the way he picked a fight with the Qataris and gave them a list of 13 demands that were impossible to reach. It's kind of his style. This is his MO.
But if he wants these guys out, who does he want in?
Well, that's the biggest problem. I mean, part of the people that they're favoring is this MEK group, which is Mujahideen group that are this ultra-Marxist, were deemed to be a terrorist organization by the Americans up until very recently. They have the support of people like John Bolton. They have the support of
New
Pompeo.
National Security Advisor,
Absolutely.
New Secretary of State.
There's a lot of things going on here, and there is this sentiment that the time is ripe for regime change. Unfortunately, some of the protests that started in December has fed, in Iran, I should say, has fed into the narrative that this is the time to do it. We see, I think, a aligning of stars where there are, a number of powers beating the drums of war, particularly the Israelis against the Iranians. And this is all playing out, frankly, to the benefit of MBS, but more importantly, MBS is feeding this line, this narrative. And we see it, and to be exact in terms of where this communication is happening, just to give it a little more preciseness, is Jared Kushner, who we know as the son-in-law of Trump, is the so-called envoy to an Israeli-Palestinian peace process, very close to the Netanyahu government, has a very good relationship with MBS. There has been many reports that they have been talking to each other. So there are this, in cahoots, MBS and Jared Kushner, which I find, two young people who frankly are not sophisticated in their international analysis of events and foreign affairs, in charge of a really big file. You know, we're talking about really huge issues that experts have worked decades on.
Mind you, Besma, I mean, we know that Donald Trump is overwhelmingly responsible for the thaw in relations between the two Koreas because, of course, he told us so.
That's right.
So maybe Kushner gets a lot of credit for whatever peace may break out between Israelis and Palestinians. Who knows?
I would love to put a bet on the table with that.
This is not a betting program. This is a family program.
There's another side to this, though, and it's very important. There are two things. One is that, yes, regime change is a maximalist goal. Both Riyadh and Tehran would like regime change in the other capital, and that is their maximal idea of, and neither of them are going to get it, frankly. But there's a more minimal Saudi goal, which is to contain Iran in Syria and Iraq and begin to roll them back. And I think Basma's critique of some of Saudi Arabia's foreign policy was sound, but there are other aspects of it that have been more deft, more political, and more successful. I mean, you certainly look at Saudi outreach to Iraq since 2014. I think you see a lot more careful, a lot of carrots, not sticks, a lot of honey, not vinegar, and quite a good deal of success. Now, we'll see how far it can go, but it's not as if they just charge in like lunatics all the time or go for broke all the time. They, like all other powers, including Iran and everybody else, try to achieve specific goals with limited means, and sometimes they get it more right than others. But I mean, I'm not saying that anyone in the Middle East right now is a brilliant diplomatist. But what I am saying is that there's an interesting range of Saudi foreign policies using different tools in different circumstances.
Okay, a couple of minutes to go here, and Besma, let me ask you about Vision 2030 is MBS's plan, and it essentially lays out a roadmap for where he'd like the kingdom to be 12 years down the road. Tell us, in your view, what he does envision by the year 2030 for his kingdom.
So let's be precise. It's a McKinsey report written, and not to knock McKinsey, but anybody who knows management consultants, it's management consultant speak. Very optimistic, very positive. Look, I love the opening paragraph. That it was all about how young people in Saudi Arabia are bored. I mean, that was an exact line. It's absolutely true. So some of this is very much welcome. Again, that social cultural change, fantastic. Now, talking about the economic changes that they want, as an international economist, I can tell you these are really lofty goals that are going to be hard to achieve. This idea of creating these, economic hubs. I mean, part of 2030 is about creating these fantastic, uber modern cities. Great. But, one thing that management consultants can tell you is that people are attracted to certain cities that are livable, that are creative, that have cafe culture, that have creativity, poets, artists. Saudi Arabia is arresting its poets and artists and intellectuals at a faster pace than any other country in the region at the moment. That's not conducive to creating that kind of society that it wants to build. So there's a mismatch here. It talks the talk in terms of wanting foreign investment, of wanting to create a diversified economy, of wanting to create meritocracy, although not quite meritocracy, because that word also might not be, go down very well in the monarchy. But all sounds good, all great buzzwords. But the reality is you need a liberal democracy to make those things flourish.
Well, a liberal democracy, Hussein, doesn't necessarily execute 100 people a year, which is what they're doing there.
Well, but they don't have a liberal democracy and nothing even remotely like it. But I think we should be a little reticent not to conflate democracy and political decentralization of power with progressive social change. In human history, there have been a lot of instances of positive progressive social change from the top down. We didn't see too much of it in the 20th century, so we forgot that it's possible. And I agree, at a certain point, you need empowered people, you need public buy-in, you need the consent of the governed. All that's true, no doubt. But I think it is definitely possible for an autocratic system and a monarchy to do better things and to push the country in the right direction. As far as and I think that is happening here, at least socially and culturally. So as far as 2030 goes, every Saudi I've talked to, including people very critical of the government, have said the same thing to me, more or less, which is something like, we know this won't be 100% successful. We're hoping for 20%. And then you ask in some way or another, what 20%? And they all say the same thing, any 20%. In other words, there's dynamism, there's movement, there's moving away from a sclerotic status quo that just would not change. And now there's a lot of change, and some of it may be good, some of it may be in the wrong direction, some may work, some may not work, but something's happening here. And it's happening for the first time in a long time. And most of it is moving generally in the right direction. Though I would certainly agree that given the concentration of political power in the hands of the king and the crown prince, if you don't have the development of another set of layers to come up underneath, that's going to be very problematic in the long run.
Well, we hope we've whetted the appetite of our viewers to stick around and watch House of Saud, the first of three-part BBC documentary, which will air immediately after this program. Hussein Ibish, Besma Momani, thank you so much for joining us on TVO tonight.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.